They called it impossible. A fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe's most experienced aces dismissed it as American fantasy. Yet on March 6, 1944, over the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, their worst nightmare became reality. A silver streak with American stars tore through formations that had ruled European skies for years, staying with the bombers when every other escort had turned back. How could a single-engine fighter fly 1,650 miles without stopping? What revolutionary breakthrough turned the tide of the air war and made Germany's greatest pilots flee in terror from a machine they thought couldn't exist? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The answer lies in the brilliant mind of a man the aviation world had written off as a dreamer, and in the desperate gamble that transformed aerial warfare forever. This is the story of how American ingenuity created the most feared fighter plane in history, and why German pilots would rather bail out than face the silver demon that could appear anywhere, anytime, with enough fuel to hunt them to their very doorsteps. The year was 1940, and Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. German bombers darkened the skies over London, while Messerschmitt fighters swept Royal Air Force defenders from the air with ruthless efficiency. Across the Atlantic, American aircraft manufacturers watched in horror as their allies' desperate pleas for help grew more urgent each day. The problem was brutally simple. Every fighter plane in existence could only fly a few hundred miles before running out of fuel. Bombers needed escorts to survive, but no escort would stay with them for more than a fraction of their mission. In the sterile corridors of North American Aviation's Inglewood factory, Chief Engineer Edgar Schmood stared at blueprints that represented 5 years of failures. Every major aircraft company had tried to solve the range problem. Lockheed's P-38 Lightning showed promise, but proved too complex and expensive for mass production. Republic's massive P-47 Thunderbolt packed tremendous firepower, but guzzled fuel like a thirsty giant. The British Supermarine Spitfire, though deadly in dogfights, could barely make it across the English Channel before needing to turn back. Schmood was different from his contemporaries. Born in Germany but raised in Brazil, he understood both European precision engineering and American mass production techniques. His colleagues at North American thought him obsessed, perhaps even unbalanced, as he filled notebook after notebook with calculations that seemed to defy the laws of physics. How could a fighter plane carry enough fuel to fly from England to Berlin without becoming so heavy it couldn't fight? The breakthrough came not from adding more fuel tanks, as everyone expected, but from a revolutionary understanding of aerodynamics that would reshape aviation forever. Schmood's team discovered that by creating an aircraft with extremely low drag, they could achieve unprecedented fuel efficiency. Every curve, every surface, every component would be designed not just for speed or maneuverability, but for slicing through the air with minimal resistance. The P-51 Mustang's distinctive shape began to take form in late 1940. Its fuselage was longer and more streamlined than any fighter before it, resembling a sleek torpedo more than the stubby angular designs that dominated military aviation. The wings were thin, swept slightly back, and positioned with mathematical precision to reduce drag while maintaining lift. Most importantly, Schmood convinced his superiors to design the aircraft around a revolutionary new cooling system that would eliminate the drag-inducing radiator scoops that plagued other fighters.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Controls were heavier, the responses more deliberate, and the landing characteristics unlike any fighter in service. More troubling still, the American-built Allison engine produced far less power than expected, leaving the prototype sluggish and underwhelming. British officials who witnessed the test flights were politely disappointed. The Royal Air Force had ordered over 600 of these aircraft sight unseen, betting their nation's survival on Schmood's promises. Now, watching the silver prototype lumber through basic maneuvers, they wondered if they had made a catastrophic mistake. German intelligence reports from spies embedded in American factories described the P-51 as an interesting but ultimately inadequate design typical of American overcompliance and underperformance. The aircraft industry trade publications were less diplomatic. Aviation Week dismissed the Mustang as another example of American designers prioritizing appearance over function. Skeptical engineers calculated that even if the P-51 could somehow carry enough fuel for extended range, it would be too heavy and sluggish to survive combat against seasoned Luftwaffe pilots flying purpose-built interceptors. What none of them understood was that Edgar Schmid was playing a much longer game. The Mustang's airframe had been designed not around the limitations of current engines, but around the potential of power plants that didn't yet exist. He had studied reports of British engine development and become convinced that Rolls-Royce was on the verge of a breakthrough that would change everything. The company's new Merlin engine produced nearly twice the horsepower of the Allison while consuming less fuel per mile flown. The marriage between the Mustang airframe and the Merlin engine happened almost by accident. In April 1942, a Rolls-Royce engineer named Thomas Hitchcock was visiting North American Aviation's facilities when he saw one of the early P-51s sitting in a hangar. Having worked on the Merlin program for 3 years, he immediately recognized that the Mustang's clean aerodynamic design would be perfect for his engine's characteristics. A series of hurried phone calls between California and Derby, England, resulted in authorization for what would become the most important engine swap in aviation history. The first Merlin-powered P-51B took to the skies on November 30, 1942, and instantly transformed from an adequate fighter into a world beater. The British engine supercharger system maintained full power at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air. More importantly, the Merlin's superior fuel efficiency, combined with the Mustang's low-drag design, produced a combat radius that seemed impossible to German intelligence analysts. Captain William Anderson was among the first American pilots selected to fly the new variant. A veteran of the Eagle Squadron who had fought Messerschmitts over Britain, he understood better than most what the P-51B represented. During his first extended-range test fight, Anderson pushed the aircraft to its limits, flying from England to a point over occupied France that should have been unreachable by any single-engine fighter. When he landed back at his base with fuel still in the tanks, ground crews initially suspected a fuel leak had prevented the tanks from emptying properly. The mathematics were staggering. With external drop tanks that could be jettisoned when empty, the P-51B could fly over 1,650 miles without refueling. Maneuverability and diminished maneuverability to unacceptable levels. They concluded that American pilots were either lying under interrogation or had been deliberately fed false information to spread confusion among German commanders. Major Heinrich Wertmann, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilots, was among the skeptics. Having flown captured British and American aircraft extensively, he understood their limitations intimately. During a briefing at Rechlin Airfield in early 1943, he dismissed intelligence reports about the P-51B's range as typical American propaganda designed to force us to disperse our interceptors across too wide an area. His confidence would prove catastrophic. The Luftwaffe's entire defensive strategy had been built around the assumption that enemy fighters could only penetrate a few hundred miles into German airspace before fuel limitations forced them to turn back. This created safe zones where German fighters could refuel, rearm, and regroup between attacks. Factory complexes, training bases, and logistics centers had been positioned based on these calculations. The first production P-51Bs began arriving in England during the summer of 1943, but their initial combat missions were deliberately kept short to avoid revealing their true capabilities. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, understood that the element of surprise would be crucial. His pilots flew missions that could have been completed by any other fighter, while mechanics worked secretly to extend the aircraft's range even further through improved fuel management and streamlined external tanks. By autumn 1943, the P-51B groups had quietly replaced most of the short-range P-47 Thunderbolts and twin-engine P-38 Lightnings that had been struggling to provide adequate bomber escort. German intelligence noted the change but failed to grasp its significance. To Luftwaffe analysts, one American fighter was much like another. All suffered from the same fundamental limitation of insufficient range to pose a serious threat to targets deep inside Germany. The deception was so complete that even some Allied commanders remained skeptical of the P-51's capabilities. During planning sessions for increasingly ambitious bombing missions, veteran officers questioned whether the new fighters could really perform as advertised. The stakes were enormous. If the escorts ran out of fuel and abandoned the bombers over Germany, hundreds of air crews would die in the resulting slaughter. Test pilot Major Robert Johnson provided the final proof during a classified mission in December 1943. Flying alone in a P-51B loaded with maximum fuel, he penetrated German airspace farther than any single-engine fighter had ever traveled. His route took him over Hamburg, then Berlin, then Prague, before returning to England with fuel remaining. The round trip of over 1,400 miles demonstrated that the Mustang could indeed reach any target in Germany while retaining enough fuel for combat. The psychological impact on American bomber crews was immediate and profound. For months, they had watched their fighter escorts turn back at the German border, leaving them to face interceptors and flak alone for the most dangerous portion of their missions. Casualty rates among bomber squadrons had become unsustainable, with some units losing over half their aircraft on deep penetration raids. Now, for the first time, bomber pilots saw sleek silver fighters pulling alongside their formations over targets they had never dreamed could be reached by escorts. Colonel James Morrison, a B-17 pilot with the 8th Air Force, later described the moment he first saw P-51s over Berlin. "It was like seeing angels. We'd been dying out there alone for so long that some of us had started to think deep missions were suicide runs. Suddenly, there were American fighters right there with us, over the heart of Nazi Germany." The transformation went beyond mere range. The Mustang proved superior to German fighters in almost every measurable category. It was faster than the Messerschmitt Bf-109 at all altitudes,
More maneuverable than the Focke-Wulf 190, and could outclimb both while carrying external fuel tanks. Most importantly, it could maintain these performance advantages throughout missions that would have been impossible for any other fighter. German factory workers began reporting formations of silver fighters appearing over industrial targets that had been considered beyond the reach of enemy escorts. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to facing bombers protected only by their own guns during the final approaches to target areas, suddenly found themselves engaging fresh American fighters that had flown hundreds of miles just to reach the combat zone. The psychological warfare aspect was as devastating as the physical destruction. German civilians who had been told their homeland was protected by distance and defensive fighters now watched American escorts dogfighting directly over their cities. The myth of German invulnerability, already strained by mounting losses, began to crumble as silver Mustangs appeared in skies that were supposed to be safe. Luftwaffe training programs struggled to adapt to the new reality. Flight schools that had focused on short-range interception techniques suddenly needed to prepare pilots for sustained combat against fighters that could pursue retreating Germans all the way back to their airfields. The psychological strain on German pilots increased dramatically as safe havens disappeared one by one. Major Wertmann, the skeptical test pilot who had dismissed intelligence reports about the P-51's range, encountered his first Mustang over Brunswick in February 1944. Flying a Messerschmitt Bf-109G, he engaged what he assumed was a lost American fighter operating far from its base. The subsequent dogfight lasted nearly 20 minutes, with the Mustang pilot demonstrating fuel reserves that should have been impossible. When Wertmann finally disengaged and headed home, the American fighter pursued him for over 100 miles before finally turning back. The incident report Wertmann filed that evening marked a turning point in German understanding of what they faced. For the first time, a senior Luftwaffe officer officially acknowledged that American fighters possessed range capabilities that fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the air war. The report recommended immediate dispersal of German fighter units to prevent the concentrated attacks that had previously been possible when enemy escorts had predictable fuel limitations. But dispersal meant dilution of strength, and the Luftwaffe was already outnumbered by growing margins. Spreading defensive fighters across hundreds of potential targets ensured that no single point would have adequate protection. German fighter pilots found themselves flying increasingly desperate missions, never knowing whether they would face a handful of bombers with minimal escort or massive formations protected by swarms of long-range Mustangs. The industrial implications were equally severe. German aircraft production had been concentrated in specific regions under the assumption that distance would provide protection from sustained air attack. Now factories that had operated safely for years found themselves under regular assault by bombers escorted all the way to their targets. Production schedules that had been planned around occasional nuisance raids suddenly had to account for systematic destruction campaigns that could continue indefinitely. By winter 1943, Edgar Schmidt's impossible dream had become Nazi Germany's worst nightmare. The P-51 Mustang had not just extended the range of American air power, it had eliminated the concept of safe distance entirely. German pilots who had grown accustomed to predictable engagement zones suddenly faced an enemy that could appear anywhere, anytime, with enough fuel to stay and fight until the battle was decided. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would demonstrate the full terror of the Mustang's capabilities.
The Nazi war machine was about to learn why German pilots had begun to fear the sound of Merlin engines more than any other threat in the sky. The Silver Fighters were coming, and this time there would be nowhere to run. March 6, 1944 dawned gray and bitter over the 8th Air Force bases scattered across East Anglia. Ground crews worked through the pre-dawn darkness, their breath visible in the frigid air as they loaded external fuel tanks onto sleek silver fighters that would soon penetrate deeper into Nazi Germany than any escort mission in aviation history. The target was Berlin itself, the very heart of the Third Reich, a city that German propaganda claimed was beyond the reach of American air power. Colonel Donald Blakesley stood on the flight line at Debden Airfield, watching mechanics make final adjustments to his P-51B Mustang. At 29, he was already a veteran of over 200 combat missions, but today felt different. The fuel load his aircraft carried was unprecedented for a single-engine fighter. The external tanks so large they seemed to dwarf the sleek airframe beneath them. Intelligence reports indicated that German fighter strength around Berlin had been reinforced specifically to counter the growing threat of long-range American escorts. The Luftwaffe was expecting them, but they had no idea what was truly coming. The mathematics of the mission were staggering. From takeoff in England to combat over Berlin and back would require a round trip of nearly 1,200 miles, with sufficient fuel reserves for extended combat against the cream of the German fighter force. Every calculation had been checked and rechecked, every contingency planned for, yet the margin for error remained razor-thin. A headwind stronger than forecast, an extended dogfight, or a navigation error could leave dozens of American fighters stranded over enemy territory with empty fuel tanks. Lieutenant Colonel James Goodson, leading the 336th Fighter Squadron, briefed his pilots with characteristic understatement. "Gentlemen, today we're going to visit Herr Hitler in his backyard. The Germans think it's impossible for single-engine fighters to reach Berlin with enough fuel left to fight. We're going to prove them wrong." His pilots, many of them barely 20 years old, tried to mask their nervousness behind cocky grins and casual banter, but the tension was unmistakable. They were about to attempt something that violated every accepted principle of fighter operations. The first bombers began taking off at 0630 hours. Their heavily loaded B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators struggling into the gray sky with maximum fuel and bomb loads. Wave after wave of four-engine aircraft formed up over the English countryside, their formations so vast they stretched across dozens of miles of airspace. Nearly 800 bombers would participate in the mission, representing the largest deep penetration raid ever attempted against the German capital. At 0715 hours, the first P-51 Mustangs began their takeoff roll.
The external fuel tanks made the aircraft nose-heavy and sluggish, requiring careful attention to keep them straight on the runway. Captain Charles McCarkle, a veteran pilot with the 357th Fighter Group, later described the sensation. It was like trying to fly a fuel truck. The plane felt completely different with those big tanks hanging off the wings. You had to trust that once you dropped them, you'd get back the fighter you knew how to fly.
Network. Luftwaffe controllers scrambled every available fighter, confident that their pilots would face the usual scenario. A few minutes of combat against short-range escorts, followed by hours of free attacks against defenseless bombers. Major Günther Rau, one of Germany's most successful fighter pilots with over 200 victories, led a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109s from Jüterbog Airfield, south of Berlin. His orders were simple: engage the American escorts over Western Germany, forcing them to jettison their external tanks and retreat before reaching the capital. Intelligence assured him that no American fighter could carry enough fuel to remain effective over Berlin itself. The first contact occurred at 10:45 hours over Brunswick, exactly as German controllers had predicted. Rau's formation dove on the lead elements of Mustangs, expecting to scatter them in the traditional manner. Instead, the American fighters dropped their external tanks and turned to meet the attack with a ferocity that caught the German veterans completely off guard. These were not the fuel-starved, desperate pilots they had grown accustomed to fighting near the German border. These Americans flew with the confidence of pilots who knew they had hours of fuel remaining. The dogfight that followed shattered German assumptions about American capabilities. Captain Don Gentile, flying with the 4th Fighter Group, engaged 3 Messerschmitts simultaneously while maintaining perfect formation discipline with his wingmen. The German pilots, expecting quick victory before the Americans ran low on fuel, found themselves in an extended battle against opponents who seemed to have unlimited endurance. Major Rau himself was forced to disengage after 15 minutes of combat when his fuel gauge showed dangerous levels. As he headed back toward his base, he looked over his shoulder to see the American formation continuing eastward toward Berlin, apparently unaffected by the encounter. For the first time in his career, he began to understand what German intelligence reports had been trying to tell him. These were not the same limited-range fighters the Luftwaffe had been defeating for years. The psychological impact on German pilots was immediate and devastating. Captain Franz Stigler, a veteran of the North African campaign, was among the Focke-Wulf 190 pilots scrambled to intercept the formation over Magdeburg. His post-combat report, filed later that day, captured the growing sense of doom. The Americans fought like men with unlimited time and fuel. When we tried to break off and regroup, they pursued us aggressively. We could no longer count on distance and fuel limitations to protect us from sustained engagement. The bomber formations pressed on toward Berlin, their silver escorts weaving protective patterns above and around them. German controllers watched in growing alarm as their carefully planned interception strategy collapsed. Fighters that should have been refueling and rearming for additional attacks were instead engaged in running battles with Mustangs that seemed capable of fighting indefinitely. At 11:30 hours, the first American bombers appeared over Berlin's outer defenses. The flak was intense, filling the sky with deadly black bursts that claimed several B-17s before they reached their targets. But the real shock for German defenders was the sight of American fighters flying combat air patrol directly over the Reich capital. Civilians in the streets below stared upward in disbelief at silver aircraft with American markings dogfighting with Luftwaffe interceptors over the government district. Colonel Blakesley led his group in aggressive sweeps over the city, hunting for German fighters attempting to attack the bombers. His fuel gauges showed levels that would have been impossible in any other aircraft, enough to sustain combat operations for another hour while still maintaining reserves for the return flight to England. The Mustang's revolutionary design had achieved what German engineers had declared impossible: a single-engine fighter that could project American air. The industrial district erupted in smoke and flame as the bomber formations released their loads over aircraft factories and ball bearing plants that had been considered beyond the reach of sustained attack.
For the first time since the war began, German workers in these facilities faced the terrifying realization that distance no longer provided protection. American bombers, escorted by long-range fighters, could now reach any target in the Reich with impunity. Major General Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, received reports of the raid from his headquarters near Berlin. The intelligence summaries painted a picture that challenged everything the Luftwaffe thought it knew about air combat. American fighters had not only reached Berlin with sufficient fuel to fight, but had maintained air superiority over the capital throughout the entire bomber attack. Several German pilots reported being pursued by Mustangs for distances that should have exhausted any fighter's fuel supply. The return flight provided even more devastating proof of the P-51's capabilities. German fighters attempting to attack the bombers during their withdrawal found themselves engaged by Mustangs that had already flown over 600 miles and participated in extensive combat over Berlin. The Americans not only had fuel remaining for the return journey, but enough to continue fighting aggressively against any German aircraft that approached the bomber formations. Captain Robert Johnson, flying with the 56th Fighter Group, described the return flight in his mission report. "We had been airborne for over 4 hours and engaged in combat multiple times, yet the aircraft still had sufficient fuel to pursue enemy fighters attempting to attack our bombers. The Germans seemed shocked that we were still there, still fighting hundreds of miles from our bases." The psychological warfare aspect proved as devastating as the physical destruction. German pilots who had grown accustomed to safe zones where they could refuel and regroup suddenly found American fighters appearing anywhere over the Reich. The predictable patterns of engagement that had governed air combat were completely disrupted. German defenders could no longer count on fuel limitations, forcing American escorts to withdraw at predetermined points.
Germany with sustained fighter escort. The psychological impact on German morale was profound. Civilians who had been told their homeland was protected by distance and defensive fighters now watched American escorts dogfighting directly over their cities. Colonel Blakesley's post-mission briefing captured the magnitude of what had been accomplished. "Gentlemen, today we proved that there are no safe havens left in Germany. We can reach Berlin, fight over Berlin, and come home with fuel to spare. The Germans know it now, and they're terrified." The terror was indeed real and growing. German fighter pilots began requesting transfers to other theaters, preferring to face British Spitfires with predictable range limitations, rather than Mustangs that could appear anywhere without warning. Flight training programs struggled to adapt to the new reality of facing opponents with virtually unlimited operational range. Major Rural, the veteran pilot who had led the first interception attempt, submitted a detailed analysis that reached the highest levels of German command. His report concluded that the P-51 Mustang represented a fundamental shift in the balance of air power that could not be countered by traditional tactics. German fighters would need to be redesigned for extended-range missions, or the Luftwaffe would gradually lose control of its own airspace through attrition. The industrial spy networks that had previously provided Germany with accurate intelligence about Allied aircraft capabilities struggled to explain the Mustang's performance. German engineers conducted extensive analysis of wreckage from shot-down P-51s, but could not identify any revolutionary technology that accounted for the aircraft's extraordinary range. The answer lay not in exotic materials or secret equipment, but in the holistic design approach that Edgar Schmood had pioneered years earlier. The March 6th raid marked the beginning of a campaign that would systematically destroy German industrial capacity. With the range limitation eliminated, American planners could now design bombing strategies based purely on target priority rather than fighter escort capabilities. Every ball-bearing factory, aircraft plant, and oil refinery in Germany became vulnerable to sustained attack by formations protected throughout their missions. The psychological campaign proved equally effective. German pilots who had once flown with confidence now approached each mission with growing dread. The sight of silver Mustangs in German skies became a symbol of American technological superiority and German vulnerability. Morale among Luftwaffe units plummeted as pilots realized they faced opponents who could pursue them anywhere over the Reich. Captain Franz Stigler, the veteran who had fought in North Africa, experienced the full terror of the Mustang's capabilities during a mission over Hamburg in late March.
His formation of Focke-Wulf 190s attacked a bomber group they assumed would have minimal escort coverage so far from England. Instead, they encountered a swarm of P-51s that had flown nearly 700 miles just to reach the combat zone. The ensuing battle lasted over 30 minutes, with the American fighters demonstrating fuel reserves that seemed impossible. Stigler's wingman was shot down during the engagement, and when he attempted to disengage and return to base, 2 Mustangs pursued him for over 100 miles. Only the intervention of German flak forced the American fighters to break off their pursuit. Stigler landed at his home airfield with his fuel gauge reading empty, while his pursuers had apparently continued their mission with reserves remaining. The incident report Stigler filed that evening reflected the growing desperation among German pilots. We can no longer assume that distance provides any protection. The Americans can appear anywhere, fight as long as necessary, and pursue us to our own airfields. Our traditional tactics are obsolete against an enemy with unlimited range. German propaganda attempted to minimize the impact of these missions.
But the evidence was visible to anyone with eyes. American fighters now routinely appeared over German cities that had been considered safe since the war began. Factory workers reported silver aircraft with American markings flying combat air patrol over industrial targets during daylight bombing raids. The strategic bombing campaign accelerated dramatically as American planners realized they could now attack any target in Germany with sustained fighter escort. The carefully constructed German war economy, built around the assumption that key facilities would be protected by distance, began to crumble under systematic assault. Ball bearing production dropped by 60% as factories were repeatedly attacked by bombers escorted all the way to their targets. German fighter production suffered even more severely. Aircraft plants that had operated safely for years suddenly found themselves under regular attack by formations that could maintain air superiority throughout the bombing process. The P-51 groups that had escorted the bombers to the target area would remain on station, hunting for German interceptors while the bombs fell below. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, recognized that the P-51 had fundamentally changed the nature of the air war. His tactical directives to fighter groups reflected this new reality: pursue and destroy German fighters wherever they could be found, rather than simply protecting the bombers. With unlimited range, American fighters could hunt German aircraft to their very airfields. The hunting began in earnest during April 1944. P-51 groups would escort bombers to their targets, then break away to strafe German airfields while the bombers headed home under protection of other Mustang squadrons. German pilots found themselves under attack not only in the air, but on the ground during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. Captain Don Gentile became the most feared American pilot in German skies during this period. His tactics were ruthlessly simple. Use the Mustang's superior range to pursue German fighters until they were forced to land with empty fuel tanks, then strafe them on the ground. German pilots began referring to him as the Silver Devil, a reference to his highly polished P-51 that seemed to appear anywhere over the Reich without warning. The psychological warfare reached its peak during a mission over Munich in late April. Colonel Blakesley's group encountered a formation of German fighters that immediately turned and fled toward Switzerland rather than engage. The American pilots pursued them to the Swiss border, demonstrating that even neutral territory provided only temporary sanctuary from opponents with virtually unlimited operational range. The incident report filed by the German formation leader revealed the depth of Luftwaffe demoralization. We no longer engage American single-engine fighters unless absolutely necessary for bomber interception. Their range advantage makes extended combat impossible, and they can pursue us to any airfield in the Reich. Pilot morale is extremely low, and several experienced aviators have requested transfer to bomber units. German training programs struggled to adapt to the new reality. Flight schools that had focused on short-range interception techniques suddenly needed to prepare pilots for sustained combat against opponents who could maintain pressure indefinitely. The psychological strain on German pilots increased dramatically as safe havens disappeared one by one.
The industrial impact accelerated throughout the spring and summer of 1944. German aircraft production, already hampered by raw material shortages, faced systematic destruction of manufacturing facilities that had previously been considered beyond effective attack range. The P-51 escorts made it possible for American bombers to return to the same targets repeatedly, preventing repairs and forcing complete abandonment of exposed facilities.
Strategy. Luftwaffe units were dispersed across hundreds of small airfields rather than concentrated at major bases that could be effectively attacked. This dispersion reduced the effectiveness of German fighter operations while increasing logistical complexity and maintenance problems. The end came, not in a single decisive battle, but through gradual attrition that German forces could not sustain. Fighter pilots, who had once dominated European skies, found themselves constantly retreating before opponents who could appear anywhere, anytime, with enough fuel to stay and fight until the battle was decided. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Major Rahl, the veteran pilot who had first encountered the Mustangs over Brunswick, was shot down during a mission over his own home city in January 1945. His final combat report, written from a hospital bed, captured the completeness of German defeat. The Americans have achieved what we thought impossible. Their fighters can reach any point in Germany and maintain combat effectiveness throughout extended engagements. We are no longer fighting an air war, but conducting a fighting withdrawal that can only end in complete defeat. The P-51 Mustang had accomplished what no other weapons system in history had achieved. It eliminated distance as a protective factor in warfare. German pilots who had grown accustomed to safe zones and predictable engagement ranges found themselves facing opponents who could pursue them anywhere over the Reich. The Silver Fighters had indeed become the terror of German skies, not through superior firepower or armor, but through the simple ability to be anywhere they were needed for as long as necessary. The legacy of those silver streaks across German skies would outlast the war itself. The psychological impact of the Mustang's unlimited range had proven that in aerial warfare, the ability to sustain operations was more important than raw combat power. German pilots never recovered from the terror of facing opponents who could appear without warning and fight without apparent fuel limitations. As German resistance crumbled in the spring of 1945, captured Luftwaffe pilots consistently cited the P-51's range as the factor that had made continued resistance impossible. They had learned to fear not the American fighter's guns or speed, but its ability to be everywhere at once, hunting them in skies they had once considered their own domain.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.